Hey folks, it's Tom, your Frugal Prepper. It's like 100 degrees out here. But I got this Ford van. I went over last night and took a look at it. And just wasn't really getting anywhere with the tools and stuff that I had. But it's got no pulse or no signal coming to the coil to fire the coils. But we were smelling fuel, so we thought, oh man, it's got to be getting fuel. But then I measured the injector pulse on one of the injectors. Nothing. You know, and so I've put the scan tool on, checked for RPM while cranking. Nothing. I did not do the light where you see if the service engine light stays on while cranking, which on some older Fords is a sign that there's no crank signal. So let me show you what's going on here. Alright, so this engine was just put in. It was a junkyard engine. The old engine threw a piston or whatever, mechanical problem. And so there's some things. So this is the wiring down to the crank sensor signal. Now I didn't even consider this last night. I wasn't thinking. That's a variable reluctance sensor, which generates an AC waveform. So these should normally be in twisted pairs. Like you see, this wire's twisted and shielded here. So I gotta check the colors on these and make sure that's the right ones. But we measured right at the sensor. I was getting some AC voltage. I didn't have a scope with me. And the cam sensor is giving us AC voltage. It's giving us good, strong AC voltage. But up here, when I measured it, it's like the first time I didn't really get anything. The second time I'm like, yeah, there's something there. But it didn't seem as strong as at the sensor. So I'm just betting this might be our problem. And so I was on a chat earlier, and Joe's Auto Electric was on there, and I was like, hey, did these have to be twisted and shielded? I think they do. And he's like, well, check the diagram. I was like, really? Did Ford put that on their diagram? So I went and looked, and they do. So I think the problem might just be that. Now I know when I was trying to get a ground back here, the coil pack lives all the way back here. I wasn't getting a ground, but we hooked a ground up to it, and didn't seem to make any difference. And of course took my test light and went into the computer control output for each of the 3 wires. Was getting no pulsing. Also tried an LED test light just for the faster response to see. Nothing. And then I tested it, injector pulse at this injector. Had 12 volts going to it, but nothing on the pulse. So why were we smelling fuel then, was the question, if there's no injector pulse. Well, I think I figured that out too, and I'll show you what I'm talking about. Right now I can't really do much. The battery's completely spanked. I got the big charger that Mark Fox gave me, set on nuclear, and we're gonna get that battery up to charge and do a little troubleshooting on this guy and see what we can find out. Now this charger is older. I don't know how clean the signal is for modern computer controlled cars. So I normally just unhook the battery cable while I charge up the battery. But then there's some new cars that unhooking the battery for a time resets everything and can make them bad. So one of these days I'm gonna have to get probably a more computer safe charger, but I'm using that for now. So I think when I asked him about the wires, why he had spliced them like that, he said they wouldn't reach, which means maybe this harness was supposed to go down under some stuff originally, and it kind of came up and over, and then the wires wouldn't reach. I'm not sure. The cam has some splices in it as well, but I was getting a good cam signal. So let's go in here and take a look at the wiring diagram, see what we see. So this cam wire is right here. Okay, so this one doesn't look like it has been spliced. These spliced wires are going down to the alternator, and this one does not look like it's been spliced. But I bet, is this wrapped and shielded for cam maybe? I don't know, we'll see. Maybe I can open up this loom and see if it's shielded going on back too. Might be. Okay, so we're gonna go ahead, make sure we're still on 2005 Ford Freestar Freeline. Okay, and we'll go to diagnosis and repair, and we'll go to diagrams, electrical, powertrain, ignition system. Okay, so I'll move you over here so you can focus on that one. So here's our coil packs. They get fired from the powertrain control module. You can see cylinders 1 and 5 fire together, 3 and 4 fire together, 2 and 6 fire together. So this is a waste spark system. It does not appear to be a bypass system. Okay, so bypass is a GM thing. So it just appears that the computer is at boonk and it's bringing that to ground and it fires the coil. So when we bring this signal to ground, it'll fire the coil. So if we have our test light on positive, when this fires, we should get a momentary like bloop. And I wasn't getting a bloop yesterday. Now it could be that this fires so fast that you just don't see the pulse. But I also tried the LED test light, which is much faster response, and nothing. And so we see that we got a red wire coming in here for power. And we did measure that, and we were getting power, and I did load test it. It's good, and just no signal here. So if we come down, this tells us conveniently exactly what has to provide signal for that to work. So I don't know what this wire is, S107 black white. The powertrain control module, it shows it there. It's tied into ground 104, so maybe that's a ground. Yeah, that's a ground for the computer. So that's the other thing I noticed. There was no ground on the coil pack. When I hit one of those bolts, there was no ground. So there's just 4 wires coming into that coil pack. A red and the 3 controls. So it grounds off of the ground. There was no ground to the valve cover. So did a ground wire or something I could hooked up? I wasn't sure. But I did go ahead and just quickly throw a ground jumper onto the coil pack on one of the bolts, and I went to another bolt and checked to make sure it had a ground with the test light. It did. Still no fire, but still wasn't getting any control signal that I could detect. Like I said, we were smelling fuel though, so we thought we had injector pulse. So here is the interesting thing. Here's our camshaft position sensor, and we can see that's a gray red and dark brown orange. And here is our crankshaft position sensor, black pink, green yellow, or gray yellow. And if you look down here what it says used by the PCM to identify camshaft position during engine start to begin sequential pulsing of injectors. The key there is begin sequential pulsing of injectors. So for a faster start, it's pulsing that fuel real quick, I think, when it first starts. But we come over here, sends AC voltage signal to the PCM used by the PCM for crankshaft position and engine speed. So it doesn't say that it requires that for spark, but it's been my knowledge that whenever you don't have a crank on a Ford, you don't have crankshaft position, you're not getting spark. But if this begins the sequential pulsing of injectors, and then maybe at some point it takes over based off of this, well, that's why we were beginning to smell a little fuel, because probably the first couple of cranks it pulsed some of those. But then when it switched over here, there was no spark, and it switched over here, then there was no pulse. So we see that wire has been spliced into. We need to verify these colors, that they're the right colors going down to the crankshaft position sensor. But we see that there is supposed to be a shield around it, and that shield is supposed to be grounded here to ground 104, and we see that C101 is the crankshaft position sensor, and it's this little doohickey right here means that this should be twisted together. So these wires should be twisted, they should be shielded. So we got to open up that loom and see if they're twisted and shielded farther on back. There was that other twisted wire I saw, and that could be crank position or camshaft position, I'm not sure. But I need to get crank position before I even worry about camshaft position, because I'm not going to get spark without crank position. So we're going to go out here and just do a little testing here once this battery gets finished charging. Alright, so I pulled the crank sensor extension wire that they made up here, I don't think these wires are supposed to run along this way. Like they're taking the wrong route probably. Just don't know Fords well enough to know exactly how they normally run. But I've got a O2 sensor unplugged down there too that I can't find the connector for. But this is probably not going to work. I'm thinking this might be where our problem is. But before I open up this harness and start looking for shielding and stuff, I'm just going to go down to the crank sensor. We'll hook up the scope here. We'll get a signal right off of it. So for this, I'm just using my little parallax scope. It works great for these types of sensors. And so I've got another connector out of my bag of connectors that fits. So I'm going to plug this in down there at that crank sensor and see if we can get a reading off of it. And see what kind of signal we're looking at, and then we'll get that plugged back in and take a signal reading off of it up here. We'll go ahead and throw our piercing probes on and take a signal reading up here. So here is an O2 sensor. I think this is an upstream, so it's not going to run right without that being plugged in. It'll never be able to get into closed loop. But our crank sensor is hiding clear up here. So I'm just going to get my connector on there if I can. Let's see what we can do here. If this will fit, we'll see. I gotta really get up under here and look at it. Okay, there's the flat spot. Okay, I'm on it there. I don't want these to short. That'll kill my ring. Okay, there we go. So now I just gotta kind of make sure this don't get tangled up in the belt. And then we'll just get this hooked up to the laptop and see if we can get a reading here. But basically I've got my scope running here. I'm just going to crank it and see what kind of signal I can get. It's hard in this bright daylight to see anything. Let me get the battery hooked back up here. Alright, go ahead and crank it. Alright, stop. Alright, crank it again. Alright, that's good. That's perfect. Hang on real quick. Let me change my time base a little. Okay, crank it again. That's good. Alright, that's all I need for now. So here's our crank signal. That looks like a good crank signal to me. There's my trigger is set just about where it needed to be. And we're on a 1 volt scale here. So every one of these is a volt. I got like 2.5 volts here, 2.5 volts there, about 5 volts. My trigger was at 1.95. So if I look, my peak voltage, my max voltage 2.5, my min voltage negative 2.5. So peak to peak voltage is 5 volts. I call that an acceptable crank signal. So what I want to do now is try it through that wire and see if it's a weak signal. Okay, so I've got that sensor run back down. I've got these I got the sensor run back down. I've got these 2 wire piercing probes on the wires running over here in my scope, and I got my USB from my scope stretched around, so this one I can get in here and crank it and look at the laptop at the same time. You really can't see much on the screen because of the sun, so I'll show it to you here when I'm done in the garage. So our voltage is close, but it's kind of wonky. Like it's not timed right. Like it's like bouncing too far. That's not a good sensor signal for the computer to be getting. I mean, it's definitely got the voltage is 2.4, 2.5 volts, but that's a wonky signal. I mean, it's not going to have, the computer's not going to have any idea with this voltage. And it was worse than that when it was running. It was bouncing all over. So I think we got to fix that connection. All right, folks, I found out what's going on finally. I just had to kind of dig in here and do some wiring. And so I just double checked my wires. So we look here and we see that we have this blue or kind of a blue, I guess a dark blue and an orange, and we have this gray and red, and this is the wires that they extended to reach down to the crank position sensor. Great. Except look at this. This is our camshaft position sensor. Our camshaft sensor is dark blue orange, gray red. Like, uh-oh. So I pull off the camshaft position sensor down in here, peel back the tape, and we see that this one is our gray yellow and black and pink. Okay, it's kind of hard. It doesn't really look pink, but that's supposed to be pink, but it's just old. And that's hooked up to the cam. So that's why he had to extend these wires. They wouldn't reach. This was just supposed to go down here to the camshaft position sensor. And if you look, this whole wiring harness that's run over the top here, I pulled up the wire routing diagram. And so if you look, this part right here is supposed to come down and around behind all this stuff and into the crank. And so it got ran up over the top. I mean, it's an easy enough mistake to make. When you pull an engine, you lose track of where things routed. But the connectors are keyed the same. They're exactly the same. They'll plug in. So instead of using two different types of connectors, Ford used the same, thinking that the wires wouldn't reach, and they wouldn't, except they were extended. So I think if we just put this back and see here, this is your shielded wire that you're supposed to have for your crankshaft position sensor. And that goes all the way down around here, and I bet you that's where that comes out to. So we just got to fix this and route this around the right way, and I bet you this thing will start and run great. Alright, so I pulled the alternator off. I took the one bolt out of this bracket. This bolt's loose. I think it'll need tightened up. I don't think it got all the way tightened when he put the motor in. But anyway, I tilted this forward. And guess what's hanging out back here? It's the wire for the O2 sensor. So all of this is supposed to route down this way and around. So we'll get this fixed up now. Alright, so I got all the wiring straightened back out and I got everything back together. I rewire loomed everything. Made it as neat and as factory as possible. But this line here now runs down beneath the power steering. The O2 sensor's hooked up. Oh, that's good. I did try starting it once. I had some fire, some action, but I started to have like weird backfires and stuff. So I found that I had a couple plug wires crossed. I had number 5 and 6 crossed. I switched those around, and now I think we're going to start it up, and this thing's going to run. Let's see what happens. Let's see what happens. Hey, that sounds better. Got a little exhaust leak, but she runs. Almost sounds like it might have a misfire. Yeah, it sounds pretty good at higher RPMs there. Well, we'll let it run and see what the computer tells us. But definitely better than it was. Amazing when you got the camera crank in the right place, she runs. So I'm gonna let it kind of warm up here a little bit and see if we throw any misfire codes or whatever. Yeah, she got a misfire, and she got me. I just decided to make sure this wire was plugged on tight, and pow! So somewhere she got a misfire. I know these with aftermarket wires, and these wires look pretty new. They have a bad time leaking if you don't fill them up with some silicone grease. So I'm gonna try that and see what happens. But these coil packs are also known for going bad and having cracks in them. So let me see. Try to get it running on all 6 cylinders for them. Let's see here. It was just one of these two that got me. I was just pushing down on the top of it, and she's at me. She's at me good. Yeah, look at that. There's all kinds of corrosion and stuff in there. That's not good. This thing might need a new coil pack. You're not supposed to zap you when you touch them on the top that way. Which tells me there might actually be a crack in the housing on this coil pack. Probably visual inspection is about the only way you're going to see it, but I'm going to goop them up with some silicone or some dielectric gel. See what happens. Alright, so the plug wires on this guy, I was getting a miss on 1 and 5, which are on the same bypass coil there. So I just wanted to inspect the plug wires to make sure they weren't shorted. Unfortunately, when I took number 5 off up front there, it was stuck on. So it I worked with it and worked with it trying, but eventually you can't really see, but the metal part inside stayed on the plug and the wire ripped off. It was that little piece right there. So I just got a cheap wire set at AutoZone, put on there, and I was suspecting the coil pack. And so when I pulled the coil pack off, I just inspected it. You know, unfortunately, I probably should have just done this first and not tried to pull those wires off to check that. But it is what it is. You know, I'm just trying to see if I can show you. But let me flip the camera around. It's really hard to see, but right down in there on this one, right down in the crevice there is a crack where it's been arcing out of there, and I think it's just been arcing over to a ground. That's probably what popped me when I stuck my hand back there. So I was like, I really want to verify this before I spend the money on a coil pack. So my truck has a 4.2, which is just a 3.9 with a taller deck height. Uses the same coil pack. So coil pack from my truck, I put it in, and now we're going to start it up and see if she runs smooth. I forgot to plug the control wire back into the coil. That plugged in. Okay, now let's fire it up. Alright, I got some plug wires out of order apparently. Let me double check these. Okay, so it looked like I had 1 and 3 crossed. Let me check the rest here. 5. And 5 is, oh no, this is 1. Oh, okay, hang on, what did I do? Oh. So my coil goes this way. So I have 4. See this, okay, this one. So this one is 4. So 4 goes down on that end. Yep. these 3. So I got 4 right here. So 4 will go down here. Okay. And then 6 would be this one. It goes in the middle. And 5 goes on the end. And then we got 1, 2, 3. So number 1 is going here. And oh, yeah, that's crossed. Okay, there's where my problem is. Okay. So this is number 3. Okay, now let's try it. Got vacuum leak there. There we go. So it looks like this vacuum hose fitting for the brake booster had fallen out. I don't know if there's supposed to be a holder that keeps that in there or what, but you can only do what you can do, I guess. I'll put a couple of zip ties around this wire loom. I think that wire loom was pushing it back on it. Alright, so the Ford van there, you can even see it and all that sun. It's running. I like come up temp, cycle the fans a few times, check the coolant, check the oil. It backed it up and down the driveway a couple times, so the transmission's working. So it's to where they can run it and drive it. It still needs that windshield wiper cowl and stuff put back in. I looked in there. I didn't even see the bolts and stuff for it. I'm not sure where they are. It's kind of, you know, it smells of frustration. There's like tools and stuff out in there where poor guy's been trying to get this thing running forever. You know, just it's not the easiest engine, it looks like, to put in. I mean, it comes up the top, but there's a lot of little lines and stuff to get to. So I think he just, you know, it's a lot of work, and just trying to get it running and working, and I think it's their only vehicle. This is the kind of job that a lot of people just wouldn't take on, right? They just be like, I'm sorry, the wiring's butchered, I just don't even want to mess with it. A lot of garages would just be like, sorry. But as you can see, if you just take it a step at a time, look at the diagrams, figure out what's going on, it's a relatively straightforward process here to get this thing up and running for them. It's going to cost them a few $100s, and you know, they'll be good to go. So I mean, it's just one of those things. You gotta, if the wires aren't fitting, you gotta kind of figure out the way they went. And so, you know, the way I did that was just look it up in all data. It shows you how the wiring loom runs around the engine, and then figure out what was going on. So, you know, he probably didn't have access to all data, but what I usually do before I tear something that I don't, you know, if it's a GM 3800, I've done a blue million of them, but on something like this, I would just take lots of pictures with my phone ahead of time, how the wiring ran, so that I know how everything hooked back up. There's still a few little things, like I think there's a bolt missing that holds the transmission dipstick and stuff like that, but nothing major. So, I mean, I could probably go through and fix little things forever, but at some point, you know, you just have to, you know, it runs, it drives, and I'm not going to keep billing you a blue million hours of labor for every last little thing. I did the hose was actually split where that brake booster hooked in, and so it wasn't staying in there tight, so I just put a new piece of hose on, hooked that up to the intake, so that's good. That took care of that vacuum leak. But it's the kind of stuff I do. I always just try to use my talents to help other people out. I mean, and you know, a shop probably would have charged a whole lot more to go through all that and do all that than I would have, and they wouldn't have just troubleshot it. They would have started probably throwing a lot of parts at it too, rather than figuring out the actual problem. So anyway, I'll talk to you later. This time, Frugal Prepper.